Okay, folks, why don't we get started? Good afternoon. I'm Tim Richter. I lead the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and I'm here with my friends Quinn and Iain, who will introduce themselves. In a sec, we'll get our session started. I want to start, as we do, with the land acknowledgement, and I just want to, again, humbly acknowledge that this presentation is occurring on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial, and I want to pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge those with lived and living experience who have contributed to my knowledge and understanding of how to respond to encampments in a manner that places the needs of people at the center and focuses on solutions. And in that last statement is really the heart of encampment response. The heart of encampment response is really a conversation, understanding needs, and negotiating a solution to that. I'm thrilled to be joined by Quinn and Iain. Just a week or so ago, the Alliance released a new encampment response service. One of the things that we've been seeing with the emergence of encampments around the country is that cities are struggling to respond. And cities, I've talked to several mayors, I talked to a bunch of mayors around the country. I've seen some that have on one hand showed me their human rights, housing rights guide to encampment response, and 2 weeks later send in the police to forcibly evict encampments, right? And I sincerely believe there's a lot of mayors, not all of them, but there's a lot of mayors and councils that want to do the right thing, but they struggle to know how to do it, right? And part of the genesis of this program, of this service that we're offering now, is to help people walk through how do you do this, right? What is a rights-focused, person-centered, housing-focused response to encampments look like? And we're thrilled at the Alliance to partner with Iain from OrgCode. Iain's been doing encampment response and resolution work all over North America. Together with our team, we've got, I would say, decades of experience doing this sort of work, and we're thrilled to be able to offer that to communities. What I wanted to do in this session, what we wanted to do is introduce a bit about what this response service is going to look like, but then have a chance for a bit of a conversation. So if you have any questions, if things come up for you in the process, there's a mic at the back, and we're going to go over just a few things about the service itself and our approach and what we're going to offer, and then we'll open it up to a conversation, and I'll be the moderator, but I'll turn it over to Quinn and Iain now and walk through a bit of an agenda and an introduction. Well, everybody knows Iain, and then Quinn did the introductions more, so everybody knows Quinn. I'm not sure why we're still introducing.
Smooth. All right. Welcome every morning. Oh, see what you did to me?
Smooth.
Try again. Let's try that again. Good morning, good afternoon, whatever it is. Hi, everybody. We're going to talk about a few things, talk about the why of the partnership between OrgCode and CAEH, and we're going to talk about what we're jointly trying to achieve. We're going to talk about what the services are, and then we're going to give the majority of our time to questions and answers. So as we talk, make sure that you are getting all those questions down, and we want to have a little bit of a back and forth with you afterwards, okay? So let's talk about the partnership. So why the partnership between OrgCode and CAEH? Since the pandemic, we have worked together jointly on a number of different things, which includes some encampment toolkits and reports that we've done together. And so let's try that again. And so what we want to do is we want to continue to build on that work together. And we just saw this as a natural and logical path forward. We are seeing across the country opportunities for communities that are better realized working together on this issue than separate on this issue. We need a national approach that is local in its implementation. We need an approach that takes into consideration the very unique challenges that your individual community is working through, and we need to make sure that that is being rolled out everywhere. We also, our values with OrgCode and CAEH are aligned on this issue. We think that we have the expertise and we have the alignment to deal with the encampment issue and work on permanent solutions to those encampments over enforcement. What that means is that we want to make sure that the encampments in your community are gone. We want to make sure that you, if you don't know how to do that, get the help, support, and training that you need. We want to make sure that the people who are currently living in those encampments are served well and equitably. And we think that our partnership is well poised to be able to do that. So, this is going to include knowledge transfer, capacity building, passing information on to communities, while also learning and sharing with communities. That means that as we work in your community to end encampments, what we want to do is we want to continue to learn and identify best and promising practices and apply those learnings as we move forward across the country with other communities. We want to also bring communities together so that they can co-create and learn from each other. We want to make sure that the solutions that we have to encampments are evidence-based practices and best practices. They want to use the best possible data, to use our big brains and your big brains and all of our experience and the things that actually matter in order to make sure that a professional response is implemented. We want to reinforce through this entire process that people in encampments have rights, including human rights and the right to housing. We want this approach to be a rights-based approach that enshrines and protects the dignity of every single person in those encampments. You can answer, it's fine. We desperately care about this issue. We desperately care about the people in these encampments. We desperately care about the frontline staff that are getting burned out right now trying to do the impossible. We desperately care about the leadership, political, and in the nonprofit sector that is struggling and doesn't know a path forward. And that's what this continues to be about and will be about. We believe in an end to homelessness in encampments. We believe that everyone deserves a place to live. Now, the path forward and what that's going to look like for your community might be different from place to place to place, but that's the goal. Let's talk about services.
So as we enter into the space of responding to encampments in partnership with the community, there's really four distinct types of services that we're partnering to offer. These are all based on our experiences in working with various communities, as well as the experiences we've had in seeing mistakes and making mistakes so that we don't have to repeat some of the same mistakes. That's where we're going to leverage some of the best and promising practices that are moving forward. And we're going to do this in a way, just to reiterate, that really tries to be unique to your community and build off your community's strengths and opportunities. So we're coming at this from a place, not that you all have deficits and you don't know what you're doing, but rather to look at the things that you're doing, look at where the bump or the barrier is, and then work to help you resolve that bump or barrier. And this is how we're going to do it. One option are advisory services. This would make the most sense if your community leaders want some guidance as they develop their own encampment response plan. So we have appreciated that some communities have gone down the road of starting to put together a bit of a response plan, and then they just simply didn't know what they didn't know. And this advisory service will help put a different lens on it. Putting it another way, you develop your own plan, policies and procedures, and we're the sounding board. Helping you see where there's a lot of strengths in your plan, helping you see where there might be opportunities to strengthen parts of your plan, helping you make sure you include all the essential components that you may not have, as I said, didn't know that you didn't know. Applying perhaps a bit more of the lens, whether that's through equity, age equity, race equity, looking at gender equity in the work. Maybe it is examining the ways in which you might not have thought about other system components and how they play into an encampment. So there's a broad range of things, and this will be very much customized to the unique needs of your community. So I would say if you're a community that has done a lot of encampment response already and you're just looking for version 2.0 or 3.0, advisory services might be the best option. Other communities, in my experience, have just been winging it. There is no plan. They've been operating in the space, perhaps in an ad hoc way, sending down outreach workers or income support workers in some communities, or sending out shelter workers in some communities, or other places been working with a volunteer group or student groups to try to get them to do some of that work, especially in smaller and rural communities. I've seen a lot of that, although I've also seen it in some smaller mid-sized cities, but a lot more rural. And in this one, we can work with municipal or regional government and community leaders to develop those strategies, plans, policies, and procedures that help you focus on your encampment response. Or put another way, we'll do the consultations and the data analysis and the writing of the strategy and plan and policies and procedures, and then you review, approve, and implement. So we'll do those steps with you, the data analysis and the consultations and the writing of the strategy. There's an opportunity for partnership in that. We're not going to look at your own watch and tell you what time it is, but we're going to engage with you in such a way that we'll lead those parts that you either didn't know how to do or haven't had internal capacity to do. And that's the second part of this one, is that there's some communities where they have loads of local talent, but their local talent is so immersed in the crisis response, they don't have time to put their head above water to actually put, I was going to say pen to paper, that's so old school, fingers to keyboard. So if your community has, as I said, been winging it, wasn't exactly sure what to do, may have had some response but didn't have it codified in any way, this one might make the most sense. The third aspect, which really builds upon the strengths of the Canadian Alliance and OrgCode together, is training. So there's lots of different aspects of training that could go into this. So training on how do you actually work on decommissioning or helping encampments voluntarily wind down through a housing-focused response. What does that look like? Training on strategy and planning. So understanding how do you do that in the context of people living in places not fit for permanent human habitation. Housing-focused street outreach and how that differentiates between housing-focused or solution-focused outreach and contact-driven outreach or survival-based outreach. And in making those distinctions and types of outreach, providing additional training on things like how do you engage with people, how do you do individual needs and strengths assessments, what type of data do you need to collect, how do you need to analyze it, how do you develop individualized service plans for people outside, how do you do that data collection analysis. Perhaps your community needs to understand how to do this through a lens of trauma-informed care. Maybe you're thinking, well, what happens when people exit the encampment for housing? Do we know how to support people to stay housed so they don't return to unsheltered homelessness? That training can be provided, and much more. Or Put another way, we'll work with you to figure out who needs to be trained for the encampment response, work with you to figure out what they need to be trained on, and then we'll customize the training materials and deliver either in person or virtually. And the customized materials will be your community, your context, not taking, for example, what might work in a very large urban center and saying to a smaller community, just do this. It really has to look at what exists in that local community. Seeing some regional government leaders in the room also saying like what might work in one part of your region may not work for all parts of your region. So customizing, if you have a more rural or remote part of your region or more suburban parts of your region, how do we actually respond to the training needs that might exist where you don't have the same concentration of professional service providers? And if none of those work for your needs, we're also in a position where we will come to your community and, working in solidarity with your community, walk you through step by step of every step along the way. So we'll model, for example, how to do engagement. We'll model how to do individualized service plans. We'll model for you how to do the data collection and analysis. We'll work with you to develop that plan. We'll work on the training. This is especially going to be beneficial, again, for communities that don't necessarily have a lot of capacity historically, haven't entered into the space a lot historically, or again, have been just so overwhelmed that they're starting to get more resources on board, but they need someone who can do the heavy lifting of the full response until such time as those resources are available. So what you'd get by way of services and supports with this one is a leadership coach who will work with your community leaders and understand all the decisions they need to make as a leadership structure. What does the governance look like for that? Looking at things like what types of people from different organizations do you want to get around your response table? What are the core plan or principles or beliefs that are shared in common amongst those people? How will they relate to each other? How are decisions made in that space? And for any of you who were at my session yesterday morning, you would have seen I did a whole piece around how you get the right people around the table to have those conversations. An outreach coach who will train and model how to do street outreach to people living in encampments. And in particular, looking at everything from safety considerations to engagement, from assessing individual needs to individualized service planning. You'd also get access to a data lead, so someone who looks at numbers, understands what's the important metrics to be looking at, but also put together a framework so if you wanted to continue to monitor your response and effectiveness to encampments moving forward, you'd have an ongoing framework for doing that. And in that process, we can help you leverage your HIFIS data to the best of the ability of your community to use HIFIS in this way relative to street outreach responses and encampments. And we can provide you communication support. So how do we share with the larger community about what you're doing, how you're doing it, and the results being achieved? And that communication would happen through like kind of typical old school mainstream media, press releases, those sorts of things, but also look at things like what does your social media strategy need to be? Because you know that a lot of the chatter around encampments in your community isn't just happening in the major newspapers or the major news networks on TV. A lot of it is happening in Facebook groups and TikTok and the Instagram, the Snapchats. There's probably some others. So put it another way, we work with you to understand your situation, develop and implement a response strategy directly with local service providers and policymakers, and you can shadow us and learn along the way. But wait, there's more. Encampments always exist in the context of a broader system. So one of the things that I always highlight in encampment responses is, as go encampments, so go shelters. Like if your shelters are full and you have encampments, that speaks to one need. If your shelters are not full and you have lots of encampments, that speaks to something completely different. If you have shelters that are too far away from where the actual camps are located, it's, for example, a transportation issue. People would go, it's just too far away. Other times I would go, but it's full. Other times I would go, but I heard it was horrible. Other times, people's wrong impressions that they're permanently banned or barred, even though they're not, but just those impressions. And other instances where some communities do have long lists of people that are just not welcome in shelters. And so all of these things and more could be part of a broader kind of system examination. How do we not only respond to encampments as they exist now, how do we decrease the likelihood of encampments repeating themselves over and over again? Obviously, these individual strategies, like working with you to do the system improvement, have to be anchored in your local needs. We're not there to tell you to do things with resources you don't have, though we may point to resources that we need to try to acquire. We're not going to tell you what is impossible. We're going to focus on what are the potential solutions, even with whatever limitations you have. And we're going to do this, just to echo what Quinn said, in a manner that is truly putting the people that are served at the center of what we do. There will be engagement with people with lived and living experience. There will be engagement with people in encampments. There will be an acknowledgement that people who are served through any sort of response are in fact experts in his, her, or their own life. And we will leverage that every step of the way, so that your encampment response is designed to work with people, not to do things to people, not to do things for people, but to journey with people. We will do this in a way that leverages some very successful examples in working towards whether it's responding, decommissioning. We use lots of different language. We'll find the right verbiage that works for your community. But to be clear, we're not on the side of enforcement. We're not trying to show up and say, this is how you tear one down and just follow the law. We are there to actually say the people who are in encampments do have rights. Those rights will be respected, and we'll focus on solutions that are rights-based. If you have lots of encampments or really large encampments, this process probably takes a lot longer than the urgency that you're feeling. If you have a few smaller encampments, and I suspect in some of your communities the leaves have started to fall, if not fallen already, and some of those ones in the woods are finally being seen as people are going to and from work or going to like a kid's sporting event or whatever, and they're like, oh my goodness, there's all these people living in the woods, and they've been there all summer. But now it's being seen in visibility and you're feeling that pressure. There is a process that we can walk you through in terms of if you are interested, but I also don't want to give you the sensation that we can show up tomorrow. There will be a process of really understanding your needs and customizing our approach to meet your needs. It's not to say it can't happen swiftly, I don't want everybody thinking that it can happen tomorrow. Like the day after is fine, but tomorrow isn't. So that is the general overview of what we're trying to provide and how we're trying to provide it. We will take this opportunity, and Quinn is going to chair us on this part in terms of taking questions and feeling out if you're fielding them, I'm fielding them, or Tim's fielding them, because Quinn is better at that than anybody up here anyway. I would just look forward. The microphone's back middle if anybody has a question, and do ask people to use the microphone in case anybody has hearing issues. It increases the likelihood of being able to hear what you said.
And you can ask them in French or English.
There's some contact information. All right.
Hi.
It's the first question. You're not allowed to make it hard.
My name is Garrett Cochran. I'm the Deputy Mayor of Yellowknife. We recently went through an encampment scenario where we had 30 homeless individuals formulating an ad hoc encampment. Through the work of the city and also with the GNWT, primarily the board member, Bree Denning, we were able to de-escalate that down from 30 to 3 here this month. My question is, thank you. Do you have strategies formulated yet to de-escalate the vitriol and disinformation from the market-based housing neighbors? In other words, how do you get empathy back into the dialogue?
Yes. Short answer, yes. Longer answer?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
This part is easy.
I would generally say that many of the house neighbors, but like much of the business community, has moved from sympathy to empathy to annoyance to anger to being apoplectic. I think we're at the apoplectic stage. So how do we get empathy back in? I think it starts with really focusing on people's rights and really starting to structure it as a rights-based conversation, and in particular human rights. Does that immediately put empathy back into the conversation? Absolutely does not. But it tries to find a shared experience, as in we're all people of the same land. We all share certain fundamental charter rights. Those don't disappear just because you're experiencing houselessness. And so really wanting to focus on that. So that's number one. And number two is helping people understand, especially those who are not in the homelessness space, that our responses and solutions can be less costly than just continuing to support people in a state of houselessness. And I think for some people who are growing impatient with encampments or homelessness in their communities, they still may not care about people, but they care about money. And if they're going to care about money and realize that it is less costly to house and support someone than it is to support someone to not have a solution, sometimes that can be the hook.
If you're not part of the solution, you are the problem. And stating that it's just about money, whereas homelessness and houselessness is not purely dependent on taxpayer money.
No, and I think,
We can't hear.
Aren't following through with the set programs.
yeah, I think what Iain is saying is that there's an argument for some people, but at the end of the day, like you don't, for mayors, for elected officials, public opinion is important, right? But for the purposes of this, we don't necessarily have to keep everybody happy. We don't necessarily have to keep the market, the people living in these neighborhoods, we don't have to keep them happy. We have to protect people that are living in these encampments. We have to find an effective solution to that. And what I've seen in the past is if they may not be really happy about it and happy about it being there, they don't have a ton of empathy, they're probably apoplectic. But
Talking about us not having empathy or anything else.
not us.
Not us.
No, not us.
Not us.
No, the neighbors, the public. I'm talking about people who will get mad that there's homeless people in their neighborhoods. And we're saying, and what I'm saying is, I'm less worried about what they think.
It would be great if we could get everybody to ask the question at the microphone. There are people in the group that have hearing concerns, and so amplification is important, as well as it's not being picked up by the people at home. So we want to hear from absolutely everybody, but it really would help us if it goes to the microphone.
So yes, we can help, Deputy Mayor. Are there silver bullets? I think there's some strategies that can be replicated, but I do think we can't control the empathy of others, but we can give them information that can change their mind.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Benoit Langevin. I've been the opposition at the City Hall of Montreal. We have 1.2 million residents. We have 5,000 people living in a situation of homelessness. With the 2022 data, 33% increase in the last 5 years, and 800 people occupying public spaces across 19 boroughs, 15 demerged cities. It's huge. It's not only huge, but as you mentioned earlier, is that each borough has their own reality and their own capacity to respond locally or in a regional approach. So in this complexity, I'm trying to get answers from the federal government, as we have a housing person who defends the right to encampments and to housing, yet we have a federal government that says that it has the obligation legally to make a plan of a plan about housing. And so it seems like there is, within the government, the federal government, who kind of leads the way on is housing a right or not, and it stems down to provinces and then to municipalities. And when we look at our neighbors who now passes bills giving the rights to cities to dismantle encampment if they have sufficient response locally as a city, then it's permitted legally. So my question is, are we going in the direction that the federal government is going, the United States is going on a legal standpoint when it comes to housing? Or are we continuing to have these mixed messages about, is housing a right or is it not? Because I know we signed a convention in Geneva saying Yes, it is a right. And since 1959, Canada has signed this piece of paper in an international standpoint. But when it comes to policy, it seems that our own country has mixed messages about, is housing a right or not?
I'm not going to speak for the different levels of government. I often share your frustration, but as far as I'm concerned, housing is a right, and what we're offering is a way for us to respect and honor and deliver that right. And I understand the complexities that you're seeking, or the complexities that you're seeing, but what we're offering you is, I think, a fairly pragmatic way to work through some of those challenges and move people off of the street, out of encampments and into homes.
The other part of my question is, if we would have a policy that is similar to our neighbor on a legal standpoint, it would force our local governments, our cities, to actually invest into response to encampment. But reality is that cities are a creation of a province, and the province is a creation of a federal government. And at the end of the day, we can defend our people that are not being housed, that are not being capable of actually having options, but it has to start with a clear standpoint at a federal level in order for cities to be able to have a response that is equivalent to the level of poverty, extreme poverty that is expressed in our country, I want to say, because obviously all of our neighbors are struggling with this. And so I honestly will call you guys and see if ever this policy can be adapted per borough, per demerged cities, because on a global perspective, the amount of resources it requires, and you know, we talk about continuum of intervention and outreach workers, then mediation workers, and then after that the police, and then after that the fire department. The expenditure and the money that is being spent as we speak abroad the country, when it comes to this continuum of intervention with the encampment, I'm pretty sure it's more expensive than actually start to build projects that will make sure these people can be housed. So my question is there more of a study conducted at this point on what are the costs of these encampment, and to actually be able to convince my fellow other politician I'm working with for the past 7 years to make sure that we can bring the economical argument in?
I think I'll let Iain jump in a second, but I think there's, I'm going to put this back to you a bit, because what I'm seeing, especially here in Ontario, there is a group of mayors that have gotten together and they've said, I want you, Doug Ford, to use the notwithstanding clause to allow me to ignore the rights of people experiencing homelessness in encampments and evict them forcibly from there. And I guarantee that there are staff from some of those cities in this room, right? Part of what's happening is that they don't have a better alternative, to be fair, right? But part of what's happening is I don't think people are being convinced, the public is being convinced that this forcible eviction is compassionate. They are. Right? I think we've just done public opinion polling. It's not released yet, but it very clearly shows the Canadian public wants a compassionate and housing-focused and fair, appropriate response to encampments. They are convincing people that what they're doing is compassionate, right? I think we, like the collective we, beyond the subject of this particular session, we are going to have to fight the Doug Fords, and we're going to have to push back on those mayors that say somehow evicting people forcibly is compassionate. So frankly, we need you in the province, in the city of Montreal, on council to say, well, hang on a second. No, we can't just keep kicking, and this is something Montreal does, just evict people, push them away, right? That's not effective. And what we're trying to do here, while we can fight the political fight, is also say there's a better option.
Thank you.
Thank you. Also, CAEH is going to be in Montreal doing some work very soon. We'll be in there in December, so reach out.
So I first just want to say thank you for the work that you're doing. And I so appreciate going on to the CAEH site, going to OrgCode, going to the Homeless Hub, and learning and educating myself in sort of practical solutions to some of these things. And I guess my question is really around, as you kind of move through this work and work with various communities across Canada, urban, rural, et cetera, I guess what I'm wondering is there a plan to really publish some of those case studies? Not necessarily naming communities, because I heard what you said yesterday, Iain, about not wanting to, a number of people, being inundated with calls about how it was done. But just some of those best practices, is there a plan to sort of develop those and publish them more widely? And I should have introduced myself. I'm Lisa Peters, and I'm from British Columbia, and I live in a very small rural community. So I find it very helpful when maybe there aren't a lot of resources to be able to look to what's happening elsewhere and sort of customize and sort of figure out how we can adapt it and use it for ourselves. So thank you.
Yeah, I'll say right off the top that there is an intention, some might call it a concept of a plan, that no one's ever said that before. There is an intention to share these things as we move forward, right? And we want to get very, very good at making sure that the right information gets to the right people at the right time. And there's a number of reasons for that. One, we want to do really good things with communities. We want other communities to learn from those things and also do really good things. In addition to that, we want to use those proof points and successes to move the needle publicly, because it's not enough for us to tell people that we lowered encampment numbers by 6% over this period of time. If they keep driving past Ted, who's in a tent every day, they don't care. So we need to have these provable, believable reductions. We need to be able to get that message out that things are happening, and that not just things are happening for you and your community, but that is vitally important, but that this is part of a great movement across the country that we're dealing with this problem. You guys have anything to add?
Well, the only thing I was going to add to your question, Lisa, is a yes.
Okay.
Smooth.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Salut tout le monde, je m'appelle Stéphanie, je suis la conseillère juste ici pour le quartier 12, Rideau-Vanier. You had touched upon this earlier about, use of notwithstanding clause or whatever, but there is a growing jurisprudence on this topic. There's been a couple court cases in Ontario and BC. I'm not sure if Alberta specifically. Is there, what is generally the consensus that's coming out from the courts on this issue? And because we will have to follow, we can have all the great policies and suggestions we want. Eventually, we will have to follow that framework that's coming out of there. So I was just wondering if there is someone who's done like a lit review, looking at all of the court cases on this, and if you could just tell me, because, Richard Wagner's not calling me, but if you could tell me what the consensus is on this issue at the court level. Thank you.
You guys want to give some legal advice?
Nope. I will say that when the, in particular, what's sometimes referred to as the Waterloo decision, right? The region of Waterloo in the Superior Court in Ontario.
Which wasn't challenged.
And being in a position where that's the one that people most often reference. I will say that in some of the work we've done in other communities, I'm meeting with municipal legal departments in the encampment response, and in particular bylaws and those sorts of things. There has been mixed opinions of whether or not there is any daylight for enforcement to still occur, and they point to things like the St. Stephen's decision in Toronto, where everybody was offered access to shelter or housing, and when not everybody took them up on it, then enforcement was deemed to be permissible. So I think it points to a few things in terms of, and I'm not a legal scholar by any stretch of the imagination, but it does speak to what are the foundations that the courts are upholding relative to people's rights? I think that's important. And I would say that's probably even a more operational lens than just looking at things like shelter capacity by different population groups and what does that actually mean. It comes down to, if this is a charter issue, then we need some clarity on those actual charter implementations, much like, and I disagree with the decision, but if you look at the US Supreme Court decision in Grants Pass, at least there's clarity in the United States.
Yeah, no, I agree.
So I'd hope for that.
It might be, and I'll be honest, I haven't been on your website, but it just might be helpful to reference these on some page somewhere so people can access these decisions, because the language around the rights framework is very, very good in a lot of these cases. So thank you.
I think the one thing I would add to that is while you can look at the National Right to Housing Network, I think they may have done some work on this, but a lot of the legal stuff around this has been, can you evict them or not? We're saying we're not here to evict people, right? What we're trying to do is give cities an alternative. So really the kind of the jurisprudence, so to speak, isn't as relevant in this context, because again, what we're trying to do is uphold a right and help people achieve their right to housing. And so forced eviction's not part of this
For sure.
program.
Yeah. Merci.
Hi, Stephen Huang from MAP Center for Urban Health Solutions in Toronto. Thanks very much for forefronting this incredibly important issue. I have a question. I guess I feel that there's really no municipality in Canada that has, solved the problem in a way that we can say, oh, we should do what they're doing. And I guess to me that raises the possibility that this is not a problem of lack of appropriate or correct tactics, but perhaps a lack of adequate resources to address the problem. So I guess my question is this a situation where what we are not talking about is the need for a housing first approach to ending encampments, by which I mean having available, immediate permanent housing using rent supplements or other means, and intensive supports for people to make that move, so that the move is, it makes it a rational choice for people to make. So that's my question.
Good to see you. And I would say what you're describing, especially in some smaller and mid-sized communities, probably can be operationalized a lot faster than larger communities in terms of immediate access to housing with supports. Sometimes. You're touching on what the actual solution is, which is, and it's one of the things, back to the advisory services, some communities think that just adding more shelter capacity is how you respond to encampments. But what you're describing is more appropriate, which is, if we don't have housing solutions, how are we going to respond to encampments? And I think part of it is, how do we prioritize access within our coordinated access system? So that doesn't mean that everybody in an encampment goes to the top, but is there some sort of proportional response, in which case we weigh housing opportunities higher towards people who've been outside for a long period of time as a consideration, for example. Another consideration could be looking at how rent supplements are strategically being used in the community, and whether or not, for example, as has happened in some communities, they do want to allocate some of those specifically to an encampment response. And if so, how are those prioritized and allocated within the encampments, I think is a fair question. And to your other point around the supports necessary to stay housed, I think that's absolutely critical to the success of this, that if it's housing only as opposed to housing first, or if it's housing without the appropriate supports, where the individual has a direct voice in the type, duration, frequency, and intensity of those supports, it'll fail. And that's where those individual needs assessments in the context of housing availability becomes critical. At the same time that I think we continue to scream from the rooftops, we need more housing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what he said, but I would add a couple of things. One is the communities, there's not a lot of communities that have been successful in removing or alleviating all encampments, but there are some very good examples in Canada of encampment responses that are effective, right? Edmonton's done, not recently, but not with the police service, but in prior years, has done some really good encampment response. Fort McMurray has done a good one. There's been others around the country. I see Danielle from St. Thomas Elgin's done a really great job of preventing the rise of encampments in their community. So there's some really good examples. And I also don't totally buy the resource argument, right? Because there are responses that I'm seeing being built. For example, building shelter space, 60 shelter spaces for 60 people in a 60-person encampment that will cost more than housing with support, right? I've seen, these sanctioned encampments on a per-person basis cost more than rent supplement and supports. So I think it's about, part of it is about thinking about some of the options. But yes, the resourcing is part of the issue. One of the things, and this is something that I know Iain's done a lot of work on, is in a market where there is very little housing for some of these housing first type programs, what's an interim solution look like? Right, bridge housing. So Neganon Housing Ventures here that came to the conference, they've done a really interesting model of an Indigenous-led interim housing, bridge housing option in Edmonton. So there are options, but at the end, it comes down to what you said, Stephen. It's housing with support, housing first.
Thanks.
Hi, Jim Dinn. I'm with the Democratic Party of Newfoundland and Labrador. I sit in the legislature there. We're not the official opposition, but the third party, as they call us. Encampments came big time, I think, to Newfoundland and Labrador about a year ago when they set up an encampment across from the Confederation building, and then moved down to the Colonial building, which was the former legislature prior to Confederation. And of course, they went from 40 or 50 people in tent to 0. But that's because they brought in legislation that basically said you couldn't camp on provincial land. That was the day before the cruise ship season started. It's been I'll say this, a rough year. And it was done on an abandoned tent, caught on fire. That was the impetus to shut down the camp, move it out on compassionate grounds. And you could see in the year how the media story went, and how basically the public opinion or the narrative was changing. People were accused of being merely protesters in these tents, even though they were there throughout the worst weather in the winter. And I know we were accused of wanting to maintain the camps for our own purposes. Refused to declare. We have a government that refused to declare housing as a right, put it into legislation. And here's my, in this plan here to advisory services, because I think it was probably one of the more frustrating aspects as to who had jurisdiction. So the place they set up tent was on provincial ground at first, next to municipal ground. Municipal services such as washroom, they shut down the washrooms after a while. I don't know who brought in the porta potties, but that was what they used throughout the winter. And it seemed that, well, that's even though the city had housing, that was not their jurisdiction. That was provincial. Provincial were washing their hands of it. It was federal. Other than, I guess, in this, when you're looking at setting up a plan, where does this, negotiating this, and I don't know if it's the same for other municipalities, but in our province it became very clear that that nothing was going to get done, it was just sort of stagnated. So there are people still living in tents. They're just in isolated areas right now. We don't, and they're not necessarily safe. But I'm just wondering, in the plan is, how do you address that issue? And maybe there are municipalities that were looking for help, but again, if they are limited in their power, how do they respond to what's the provincial role? How do we bring them on side? And I understand, other than the proliferation of congregate living shelters, I'm sorry, but we got to stop building shelters. The congregate living shelters got to be something other than putting a group of people into an open room with beds. I wouldn't want to be in there. And we talk about coordinated access, but I can tell you that in my district, I have probably some of the most severe cases. We have 150 housing cases open right now. Cannot find a place for them anywhere. And it's frustrating not to be able to help. So we can have coordinated access as to who gets in, and but at the same time, there doesn't seem to be that solution in place. So I'd be interested then in two parts of that: the services plan that addresses the municipal, provincial, and maybe even the federal jurisdiction, but certainly the provincial, municipal, and then what do you do when you don't have? Even if you do have a coordinated access plan, there's no housing to send them to.
So the question of jurisdiction really varies throughout the country. Some provinces, for example, have enshrined in legislation that there's a service manager type function or something to that effect. I mean, that's especially the case in places like Ontario, where through devolution, there's essentially, it's gone to the municipality and said, you're responsible for planning housing and homelessness and, you know, a few other services. Childcare, I think, is under that. Paramedic services, I think, is under that. There's probably a few other things I'm forgetting. But it's very clearly defined who has the system manager role. In places like Alberta, there's a community-based organization. Sometimes it's a municipality, sometimes it's a separate not-for-profit, right? But there's a local community entity that is responsible for system planning, system management. So I think the bigger question is relative to who currently is mandated to do the system planning for the homelessness response. If it's the province, then it's a provincial responsibility. If it's a municipality, then it's likely the municipal responsibility. But I can't think of any instance, and I could be wrong, goodness knows I make lots of mistakes, but I can't think of any instance in the homelessness response that has essentially been devolved to lower levels of government where the federal government would say, we're responsible for your plan at a local level. I just don't think that's the case. So I think it comes down to, from a service manager perspective, who has jurisdiction. And the second thing, in terms of coordinated access, I really do believe that we need to focus just as much on coordinated exit as we do coordinated access. That getting people out of our data sets and into housing is a really good idea. And I think that there's a range of strategies. I'm not going to go over all of them again. I did that in another presentation, but there are a number of things that are getting really creative in the space of trying to create more housing opportunities amid scarcity. Everything from shared housing, which could have different legal frameworks than like a roommate situation. There's things like master leasing or head leasing at scale, so not just a building, but doing it like large scale. And then the other thing that I always advise doing in every community that says that there's no housing is look at your data of addresses of people who are receiving income support, so general welfare or disability from a province, and look at how many of those people changed addresses in the last 3 years. That'll show you where economically poor people are already moving. Then go to those neighborhoods and talk to people who are not needing your assistance to find housing and ask them, how are you figuring out your housing without us? Oh. And they don't teach real estate in social work school. Maybe we need to get the right people who are looking for housing.
And so just one thing to add and one other comment, I think on that, the other thing that we can help you work through is kind of the governance structure of your response. Because there's always lots of different players in the system and a lot of different players involved in how you would respond to this, whether it's police or the housing body or the people running coordinated access or the outreach workers. So figuring out how to get that coordinated and united in a governance structure. The other thing is there's lots of questions, so we'll have to ask folks to maybe make the question quick so we can get to as many people as we can.
This is a super quick question. I am following you, Iain, because I am following your dirty socks. But just, I think some of us here as service managers are probably in the process of creating budgets, also looking at creating our 10-year homelessness plans. Just curious, is there a financial framework built around the strategy that you're adopting in terms of what does this cost?
We'll talk.
Okay.
So here's what I want you to do. See this QR code right there? Scan it, reach out to us, and
that.
we'll be in touch. The
Perfect.
process is going to be generally is that reach out to us and we're going to talk to you. The costs will not be the same for every community because every community is going to need very different skill sets and services. So it would be irresponsible to tell you a number right now, but talk to us and we'll figure something out as quick as we can.
Perfect, thank you.
Hello, my name is Shannon. I'm originally from Halifax, but coming from Moncton, New Brunswick. I'm thankful for the presentation and all the questions asked thus far. I'm happy to hear that housing as a human right is being brought to a focus through this work. I'm curious, 2 questions. How closely does your new kind of strategy align with Make the Shift Municipal Guide to Encampment documents? And then as a second question, as we've established that in most of our communities, there's a lack of housing, and that is not a fast solution in many cases. You pointed to the cost of sanctioned encampments, but I'm curious, as someone who manages an outreach program and sees the harm and trauma done by municipal sweeps through bylaw, what is your guys' lens on sanctioned encampments as a temporary means to provide safety and reduce harm to folks that are experiencing unsheltered homelessness and there isn't a viable housing solution at that time? Thank you.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with the sanctioned encampment piece because I've been to dozens of them. And here's the challenge. Some are amazing. They're community focused, there's mutual aid and trust, they're well managed, their peer supports are doing like safety ambassadorships. So that's some of them are great. Some of them are like sanctioned internment camps, where the police drop you off in the middle of the night and essentially say, stay here or else. And some are not well managed. And some actually have more barriers than the shelters that people said they didn't want to go to. So I don't think it's as simple as sanctioned or unsanctioned. I think it's a matter of what's the operational lens, what's the service orientation, and what are we trying to accomplish. I do think that when it comes to sanctioned encampments, again, I'll go back to there's a cost component, right? So if we could rent supplement people for cheaper than a sanctioned encampment, and there was the ability to get access into private accommodation to do that, we should do that. If there's an opportunity to extend modified chronological access to people experiencing houselessness as opposed to just being on a waiting list for rent-geared income housing based upon the day you show up, that there was some sort of sequencing there based upon jurisdictions that's sometimes easier to do than other things in the space. And then the other issue with sanctioned encampments is there's no legal mechanism to force people to use them. And the reason why I bring that up is because there's a lot of pushback in communities that say, we spent all this money, we put all this effort and all this planning into a sanctioned encampment, and I still see a bunch of people down by the river. How come those people at the river aren't in your sanctioned encampment? And you say, well, they don't have to go. And then there's this public outcry. So whether they're sanctioned or unsanctioned, if there isn't an impetus to do forced removal, every encampment becomes a de facto sanctioned encampment. Right? So even if it's in a park and it wasn't a park that was set aside for an encampment and it has tents in it and the community says we're going to try to voluntarily resolve this rather than using enforcement to solve it, by omission they're sanctioning it, right? They didn't have to say, they, without saying it, have said it. So I think that when we get into this, that's part of the framing around if people are in a safe place where we can promote wellness, we should continue to engage with people where they're at and not dislodge people from their community, their belongings, or their things in such a way that will have deleterious consequences to their overall ability to stay on a pathway towards housing.
And I would say what he said, but I would add one thing is to say, I've had a number of municipal leaders ask me, should we do a sanctioned encampment? I said, well, if a disaster hit Sarnia or Calgary or Moncton, and a whole bunch of people are thrown out of their homes, would you put them up in tents? No, you wouldn't. So is a tent, sanctioned or not, the right place for somebody? The other thing you asked about the guidelines for making the shift, I would say, based on my understanding of them, our approach is entirely consistent. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, my name is Athena Pronto, and I'm a former resident at Crab Park as well as Strathcona Park in Vancouver, British Columbia. I also used to be the homeless outreach support worker for BC Housing, as well as the Vancouver Aboriginal Friendship Centre Society, as well as a peer support worker at the Downtown Eastside Women's Centre, along with at the Downtown Eastside Women's Emergency Shelter. Also working for the Lookout, and that's just to name a few places that I've experienced work, and then utilizing the places as resource. Being an administrator for HIFIS in my former positions, I am wondering how is it that you're going to implement it to where it's going to save the day for anyone? I do know that with statistical numbers that people experiencing homelessness and having to maintain further being into homelessness and being enveloped by it because of former programs such as the Family Maintenance Enforcement Program that has decimated a whole generation of our men. There's also the addiction that comes along with being homeless. Homelessness created the addiction, not the other way around. The addiction didn't cause the homelessness. Where people could be able to open their mind a bit to expand into the reasons why there are so many that are unhoused. It's because there are people that, homeowners, renters, property managers that are not opening their doors for people who clearly need the assistance. Also, with that being said, with HIFIS and utilizing another database to back up that one particular database is probably a lot smarter to utilize HIFIS as a service for collecting data. Sharing the data and being transparent is also a huge ordeal. Creating another database for people and numbering them in a numbering system that has no merit doesn't work. So I just thought I'd throw that in there at you. But maybe I'm missing the mark here, but with you in your basis for the conversation right now that I got the gist of is HIFIS is going to be one of your main projects? Because I know with Crab Park, we started with a shoestring budget, and up until last year, the park rangers and the Vancouver Parks Board took over almost $750,000 that was meant to better house people, as opposed to the new trucks they got and fancy new uniforms. So with that being said, like I said, how is it going to be that HIFIS is going to be
So let's
the
see if we
shining
can
star?
answer that question. I think the most important thing, and thank you for your question, is that we want to be transparent with any data, right? So any information that's gathered, we want to be transparent. I think we want to be transparent within the community, but most importantly, we want to be transparent within the people that are experiencing life in the encampments.
Okay, accessibility.
That means transparency, both in any information that might need to be collected in order to make good decisions, but also we want to be very transparent on why
Okay.
we're there and what we're doing. And we only want to work with them in a way that protects them.
Okay, Supreme Court injunctions stipulated that, yes, we are allowed to be in Crab Park. It's on federal land. Therefore, federal judgments are in our favor to be there. Whereas we have municipal and provincial governing agencies trying to tear us down on a daily basis. We're going into our fourth year, and like I said, we were solely based on volunteers and help from myself and my former work colleague and friend, Fiona York. We've been working all the time to try to keep this place maintained. But without power, right? They took away our power and everything else. How are we going to, I don't know, are we going to run around with laptops, tablets? How are you going to implement it into
Why don't we have more of this conversation after? Can you find me afterwards? Great, thank you.
Hi. A lot of your speech and your sessions are very insightful. I truly believe in that we should have the Homeless Prevention Act, Canadian-wide, and a lot of the initiatives and programs that we see could be part and parcel of that. But I also feel that homelessness reduction and prevention should also be one of these issues that it should involve organizations and businesses alike. We see Tim Hortons Foundation, we see the Home Depot, McDonald's Canada, doing some great stewardship with respect to helping to contribute to that. But however, we have municipalities where we have municipalities that kind of do knee-jerk reactions to complaints from businesses and complaints, and there's a lot of NIMBYism and there's a lot of negative attitudes and you name it that spark that knee-jerk reaction from municipalities, and therefore encampments get torn down as a process, as a result of that. And I'm sure there's a lot of other municipalities that see that as well. So how can we expand this further in our homelessness prevention initiatives by engaging local businesses and major corporations? How can we engage this side of it so that they can be more involved and contribute more to homelessness prevention and reduction, so that we can, on all fronts, have a good plan in place? That's probably a big question.
I think starting locally, I would say there's often business improvement areas, chambers of commerce, business revitalization zones, I call them in Calgary, that are engaged with this issue or can be engaged with this issue. So it really depends community by community on a kind of a more national scale. I've heard from and talked to different corporations that are looking for ways to help. So those kind of conversations are ongoing.
Yes, and what we want to do is be able to gain a lot of momentum in that area. We want to be able to have that push on that end of it, because it is that end of it that does influence municipalities and therefore, impacts the encampments that are in the area. Yep. So we don't hear a lot about that as a strategy or as a plan or a recipe for being able to engage these individuals in a more positive way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think, again, some of the work we're doing is, and I talked, in my keynote on at the opening about building alliances, building partnerships, and that's some of the alliances across sectors is the work that we're doing nationally now. So I guess the simple answer to your question is yes.
Can we rely on you to get kind of like a step-by-step guide on how to start?
How to do that? Mm-hmm. Can't commit to that right this moment, but yeah. It's certainly something I'm willing to talk about.
Okay. I'll be emailing you soon. Thank you. Good.
Great. Now, just to be clear, those of you that are in line, we can answer your questions. We probably don't have time for any further questions. And if you're quick, Iain has promised to put on his unitard and thrill us with communicating the magic of encampments through the power of interpretive dance. So
you didn't tell me that was part of the agenda.
Yeah.
Last
Tim,
question?
Next.
Or is that, okay. I've been working frontline housing work for the past year, a little over a year now. It quickly became apparent how I was going to have to be very creative in figuring out things and so forth. I've not really managed to get that off the ground very well, honestly. But, I'm excited to hear that you guys have these other things coming up. I think I'm also regularly struck by the fact that I don't know, maybe I'm seeing this wrong or something, but there's just not enough houses. There's just not enough homes. And I'm just like, And the creative stuff is really important, and there's creative ways to work through it. But I guess my question to you is that I've been having different developers come to me and say, hey, what can I'd like to start building things for people, places and so forth. And I'm wondering do you guys have a model or way of thinking of that, or suggestions how you go about doing that, or maybe I still have to mess around more with CAEH see, but I don't know, just wondering if you guys have a housing model that you prefer or that you to suggest or anything like that.
I wouldn't say that there's a housing model. I think a lot depends, but that's kind of that's probably an offline conversation, but there's ways to work through some of those things. Depends where you live, depends who's there, depends who the developers are, depends what is available to you, and what's available municipally, provincially, and federally. But yeah, that's something that we can have a conversation about.
Great, thank you.
Hi. My question is just around when you're engaging with communities to kind of create responses to encampments and stuff like that, how do you incorporate lived experience into those consultations, and how do you prioritize that lived experience continues to be included in the development and implementation of those responses?
Yeah, great question. So I think there's two different populations that we have to engage. So one would be people with lived experience, people who have been in encampments before and are not currently in encampments because they're housed, as well as people with living experience who are currently experiencing life within the encampments. I think both are important. I think for those individuals that have living experience or lived experience, the first thing we need to look at is there already a lived experience advisory group in the community? Because let's not reinvent the wheel or confuse matters if there already is a process by which people with lived and living experience are engaged on matters related to houselessness, homelessness, and policy-related initiatives in the community. If there is not, then I think it comes down to what is the training that's provided to the entities that will be doing the direct engagement with people living in the encampments, so that they are not going to increase the likelihood of re-traumatizing someone, so that they are sensitive to the power dynamics, so they have more than one tool for conversation starting, so that they know how to capture information to honor that people have shared their story rather than having people repeat their story over and over again. With that and the actual engagement with the encampments, we have to look at the leadership structure that's in the encampments. Some encampments have really well-defined leadership groups and have committees and representation that way. Others don't. So really looking at the dynamics of governance within the encampment itself and the leadership structure. And then even when there is the leadership structure or committees within the encampment, making sure that there's an understanding that our hope is to engage with everyone, to understand the specific strengths and needs of each person, and help people co-create the future that they want. So that we're not looking at housing as a gift, like, oh, here's something you can have, do you want it? Yes or no, to what type of housing, right? Is it shared housing, for example, or is it by yourself? If you've been living with others in community, you might want shared housing. You know, a roommate, maybe you don't. But I mean, those are the sort of conversations that are intentionally going to be had. And then, as we start to deepen our understanding through active listening and reflective listening and creating a space where people can share with us, making sure that we're translating that into individualized service plans that resonate with the people that we've actually had the conversations with. So that's like part A, B, and C, I think. I'm losing track of my mind. D, help us understand what worked and what didn't. An after action report, if you will. So if people are transitioning from encampments to interim solutions or encampments to permanent solutions, let us know, what could we have done better? How could we have done better? Was there, everything from the engagement being respectful to were there processes or forms that we could simplify? I mean, all of that has to be in scope. I really passionately believe that every person we serve is an expert in their own life, not the worker who's showing up to work with them. We're a resource, but they're the expert. So we need to leverage that expertise to develop a plan that people want to believe in, that they want to take action on, and that they're willing to co-create with the support that comes to the encampment. Did I answer your question? Thumbs up? Okay, thank you.
Kelly Gauss, City of Windsor. I wholeheartedly agree with everything that was discussed. I think the one piece that's missing from this conversation is where does the advocacy come to both the provincial and the federal governments with regards to guaranteed income? We know that people with lower income have poor outcomes in every facet of their lives, and that trajectory is very hard to overcome. As well, we have a large national demonstration project that just happened recently called CERB. We saw with the introduction of CERB that social assistance applicants went down. We saw an increase of housing outcomes, and the consequence that we're seeing in communities today is an increase in encampments, and we're sitting here twiddling our thumbs, wondering how the hell did this happen? People don't have the money to afford the housing that they need. If we gave people the money that they deserved and that they needed, they could be the stewards, for the most part, of ending their own cycles of homelessness. So where does that conversation come into all of this? So Tim, back to you. With the Alliance, I appreciate all of the work and the support to communities, but this is a public policy issue that has dragged on in our country for years. The exploitation of marginalized populations continues to happen, and municipalities and provinces and federal governments allow for it to happen.
Yeah, I'd say I don't disagree.
Hi.
Good.
So all that. So I'm Jessie. I live in Hamilton, Ontario. I am a co-researcher for a mortality data project out of Hamilton. So we count the number of people that are dying while living without rights-based housing. We've been doing that since 2021. Beyond that, I promise I'm getting to a point to question some curiosities. Beyond that, and I think it's just important, that context in this room. Beyond that, I've seen you, Iain, speak on a number of occasions. I was a worker in the housing and homelessness system and the social service system for a number of years. Prior to reaching home, I was somebody called a housing advocate, was essentially a real estate agent, finding landlords that would rent to people. That was, before the reaching home stuff. And then when reaching home came in, became, that go-between. I've worked in eviction prevention and diversion. I've been an intensive case manager, and you spoke about worker burnout. And I think like all of that and what was just said and what I've heard a lot of people say, one, housing in the private market, like we've done this well. I know I've been part of teams that have done it well in all the ways that you've outlined to do it. And it has still resulted in where we are. I saw people return numerous times. And I don't think this is anecdotal. So that the idea, I'm standing here kind of confused thinking, why are we teaching another way to talk to people, to develop some sort of way to do more things to people when it's kind of a gaslight? Like even as a worker, the reason people are burning out from my experience and from the people I worked with is because you're being asked to do something that you cannot do. You're being told you're a housing worker with no housing. So when I would go back to management and say, hey, I'm a housing worker with no housing, and sometimes people tell me to go screw myself when I show up there, and I understand that entirely because they've seen 20 of me and I have nothing to offer beyond a smile and some cereal and some compassion. I don't, and they're like, stick with the program because that's what we've learned. And now we're learning more of a program, and people are going to adopt the program. And I'm just like, I'm troubled. And I wanted to say that. I'm troubled. And what made me stand up to ask a question was when people said, when one of you on the panel said, start from where they're at. In my community, people talk about taking weapons out to encampments to beat people. It's in the news. There's been somebody from Hamilton that murdered a man in Toronto. So I think we need to meet those people somewhere, Like, we can't keep talking like we're doing all this work that then, like, promotes the idea that those people aren't doing the right thing. And so I guess what I'm leaving with you is I'm troubled by another set of programs that do the same thing, really, because there's nothing at the end of it. And I bet there's probably a bunch of other workers that will go through the same thing and then end up counting dead people at the end of it. So anything you have to say to that, I would really appreciate.
Do you want to start?
I think, first of all, the answer on the slides is that we are going to talk about systemic issues. We're going to try to work on that system. The thing that we saw in research...
Sorry, but sir, we are the system, each and every one of us. So what we do. So please respond to that, like not as a tool or a continuum or a system or a structure, but like what we can do. Please. Sorry, I won't interrupt again.
What the research we saw, particularly post-pandemic, showed us is that things are not good for people, particularly people on the front line in this work. Mental health has declined. Systems trauma is on the rise. Often that's because they're working in systems that actually tell them not to do the things that they know they need to do in order to help the people they're trying to serve. One of the reasons that the Encampment Response Service exists is because we understand that we need to fix the surrounding pieces for those individual people.
Perhaps that'd be a good response for the community, though. And rather than the people outside, like for the general community, the ones who are pushing politicians and municipalities to increase enforcement. Do you see what I mean? Like maybe there's a new kind of work to be done here. That's what I'm saying.
I think it's a both and, right? I think it's a both and. I think you're right. Like there's a lot of the public out there, as Iain said, that is apoplectic about what's going on and are in victimizing people in encampments, right? I think there's an argument to be had there. I think there's a fight with those people to be had there. But I also think you look at a place like Hamilton where you've got municipal leaders just making bad decisions, right? They're spending more money on a sanctioned encampment than it would take to provide housing and support to the people in those
Thank you
encampments.
for saying that. On a contaminated
Right.
site, no less. But
Yes, right? And so what we're saying is that we can help cities make better choices. We can help cities build better responses. It's no silver bullet, and I'm not promising to have all the answers, but there are better ways to do some of these things. They're wasting a lot of money on things that don't work, right? There are better ways, and we can help with that, right? But you're not wrong.
That doesn't get me a whole lot, You're not wrong. Like, I mean, we need places for people to live.
Yes.
Yes.
So
And we need to stop lying to them because, like me, I'm, like a smiley face going out there and, it's not okay. People aren't well because we show up with tactics instead of material resources.
Right. I think you also need to know that this isn't the only thing that the Alliance is doing. Right, we're fighting for those housing resources. We're fighting for the encampment program that the federal government's put $250 million into communities. The result of advocacy that we've done. $65 billion went into new housing last year in the last budget from some of the work we've done. So you're totally right. You need to create that new housing. It's both and, right? We need to create that new housing, and we need to help fix some of these systems that are putting you and others in an awful position.
All right, so we are near the end of our time, so I can just point you again to the QR code, and please reach out to me. What the process is going to be like is you reach out to that QR code, and we're going to get back to you as quickly as possible to follow up, gaining some information, and likely leading up to a meeting. Give us a little bit of grace if you reach out right after this meeting, because we're all at a conference right now.